one of the things that I love about the book is how you evoke the kind of mobility, and here we're getting into what I would argue are your key interventions with the book. And one of these, I think, is kind of this notion of immobility and mobility, and the way that the internet gets sort of drawn into this kind of conundrum that these youth find themselves in. And I made this little sign, look, it says immobility. Wait, here it is. I used a purple marker and everything, so it's like, see, like immobility. Is it backwards for you?
No, that looks perfect.
Okay. So that's what I thought that was really, I mean, that's me being weird, but, like what that I think is really interesting because it is a kind of, I read the book as through this kind of tension in a lot of ways. And so can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of catch-22 to going online for these young people, right? So they go online and they start out thinking that this is sort of breaking down a bunch of walls or barriers that they're facing. One being that it's incredibly difficult, one, to get the money to travel abroad, and secondly, and this is an even more difficult barrier, to get a travel visa, right? I mean, a travel visa to the U.S., a lot of Americans don't really understand this. In Ghana, you have to go to the embassy, you have to sit and do an interview with someone at the embassy, and then they make a judgment about whether you're kind of trustworthy enough to travel to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so they saw this tool that allowed them, previously young people would have pen pals, like literally write letters to people abroad, and now here was a way to do that, to reach out and make connections abroad. Mm-hmm. That was interactive and synchronous and immediate. And you could go into a Yahoo chat room and there would be tons and tons of people there, any of whom you could try and talk to. Mm-hmm. So there was this, at least initial optimism among a lot of the young people I talked to about what that meant to be able to make those connections, given that they couldn't physically, they were very limited in their ability to physically travel to these places. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think some of that exposure to the broader world was, it was disillusioning on some level because it was really hard to kind of form good, solid bonds and meaningful relationships online, or not just meaningful relationships, but kind of productive relationships that they could get new opportunities out of. And I think going online, often that was also a stepping stool to trying to get then tangible opportunities to travel abroad. And they found that it was really hard to do that, to start with making connections online and then get an invitation to get a travel visa or get those opportunities to go abroad. So in some sense, it was both a way to sort of expand a new expansive possibility, but made them confront some still enduring kind of limitations and constraints on their ability to go anywhere, to move abroad, and to travel.
And one of the things I like most about that argument is that it complicates these notions of, as you put it on page 31 here, imagination, the kind of notion that there's a kind of global imagination, right, that because of globalization and these processes, you have this, new mobilities that are enabled by this kind of access to Western media, et cetera, and that it provides what Potter says a staging ground for action. But you sort of push against this by saying, it's actually really kind of disappointing in a lot of ways for these youth, because they can see and kind of it's at arm's length, or they can't quite access those things, though they can, or rather they can't actually mobilize themselves, right?
Apadurai was definitely one of the major influences to my thinking along those lines. And I think this idea of kind of flows, like circulations and flows, it was really clear that some things flow and some things don't in and through Ghana. So Western goods, not just Western media, global media. I mean, watching television in Ghana was really fascinating just to see what it is. They're getting like Latin telenovelas and South Korean soap operas and TV shows from South Africa, and really not a kind of American-dominated television media there at all. So they're getting exposure to like ways of living, material cultures, which obviously, because it's on television, it's skewed and kind of exaggerated in certain ways. So goods flow, media flows, labor doesn't flow. People don't flow. Ghanaians would be thrilled to take almost any, especially these young Ghanaians I talk to, any job they could find if it meant that they could go to Europe or to the U.S. But it's just really hard to do. There are all kinds of constraints that are both financial and kind of politically imposed.
And so one of the second related interventions that I see that your book is trying to think through is this notion of the digital divide. So how do you see that kind of squaring with this mobility and immobility? And what, I think that you offer really good critique by arguing that it isn't just sort of the West and the rest sort of picture of digital media and digitalization. And so I'm just wondering, what do you see as your critique specifically of that?
So the digital divide, I don't want to prop it up too much as a straw man, and it can be the way people talk about it can be vastly oversimplified. The most simple way to talk about it, and the way it maybe was originally formulated, was that it had to do with access to technology. So some people have computers or can afford computers and can afford internet connections, and some people can't. And the divide is that the people who can get all these new opportunities and sort of advance themselves in certain ways that leave those who can't even further behind. People have added to that, it's not just about the technology, it's about like the literacies necessary to use it. Okay, sure, that's part of it too. I think what I found, because ostensibly these Ghanaian internet users are on the other side of the digital divide by some of those definitions. They're users. They have access. They're able to find the funds to pay for it, and they are using whatever kind of language literacies or technical literacies they've been able to develop. But those didn't ultimately seem to be the real constraints on their ability to get something meaningful to them out of that use.
Right.
And some of the constraints really had to do with the social and interactional dynamics they encountered online. Yahoo chat rooms, I think people have moved on to other platforms now, but back then, Yahoo chat rooms were the big thing, and dating websites, right? They were not built and designed for young Ghanaians. And the way young Ghanaians think about relationships or interacting with people or expectations around friendship or what a dating relationship is like, the systems that they were using weren't designed around those understandings, and the people there were not interacting with them with those same understandings. So there's a whole challenge of the social world that people encounter when they go online as being a potential barrier to, people joining now who are joining these online communities or joining the internet in some sense very very late in the story of the internet.
And I like that this concept that that the internet wasn't designed, that there are certain aspects of these of the kind of materialities, I guess you might put it, of the kind of design of the internet that is not, that they are working with and through, but which they have to negotiate in all these really interesting ways that you describe in your book. And so that leads me, you're giving me all these great segues, Jenna, so thanks very much. Because that leads me to the next kind of intervention as I see it, which is this question of weak and strong materiality and the extent to which these young people actually have to kind of conform themselves into these designs or into the kinds of what the internet offers versus sort of remaking or retooling the internet or bringing it into their own kinds of social worlds and needs. So if you could just talk about, and you don't have to get too much into the Latourian, all of the back and forth theory about materiality, but if you can just sort of signal what you're trying to do with that notion.
Well, I was trying to find a way, grounded in my ethnographic work, to talk about the technology as being of consequence, not in a technologically determinist way. you know, but not in the way that I saw in a lot of the kind of media studies accounts of technology, which would kind of reduce the impact of those platforms to, reproducing social structures. And in the
social
way
structures for who?
So if there's a kind of a cultural system in place that shapes the way people use technology, there's nothing that kind of twists or torques or alters that structure. The technology is sort of this system of carrying and communicating symbols, I think, is the way that I describe that as weak materiality. And I wanted to try and talk about the possibility for change to arise through the combination of the material possibilities of the technology and what people like these young Ghanaians bring to that technology in terms of their hopes and expectations and their own norms and conventions and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I like that you set that out kind of at the outset of the book and grapple with that, because so often it's true that I think people begin with one or the other premise, right? Like, oh, well, this is remaking social media or remaking us into different kinds of people, or no, it's just the same old story. We're drawing it into kinds of age-old human patterns of communication or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think you set out that problem at the beginning very clearly and nicely.
I don't know if I accomplished it, but
it's a hard thing to
in the direction I think we should head, I guess, is how I would put it.
Right. I just have one more intervention that I see your work is kind of pursuing, and that is this kind of notion of fieldwork itself. And you've developed this in a different article, but it's about your fieldwork as a network site. So can you just talk about that for a second?
Yeah. I think like many scholars like myself who are doing fieldwork in sites where we're not sure where the site is or where it starts or where it ends, many people look to George Marcus's piece on multi-sited ethnography to kind of give us some ways of thinking about our site.
Following things, right?
Yeah, right. And that's pretty essential to ethnographic practice, is to locate whatever phenomenon you're studying in space and place, right? And so sometimes that can be pretty simple. I think these days it's become more and more difficult to figure out where we should be and where we should exist if we're studying a social phenomenon. And I think with my project, I really started thinking I want to study internet cafes in Ghana. And so that's a site, that's a place. The internet cafe is, I can get on a plane, fly to Ghana, go find an internet cafe and sit in there and see what happens. And that's where I started. But when I got to these internet cafes, I think the word cafe was misleading to me. I thought, oh, there'll be like social spaces and people will sit around and talk and there will be something to observe in these cafes. And they weren't like that at all. And so I immediately found that I needed to spend time, studying whatever
in other places.
Yeah, in other places. And so, I came up with some sort of strategies to do that and to think about the coherence of what I was studying based on how I was doing that. And it was inspired by Marcus's notion of multi-sited ethnography. In writing it up, I tried to write it in a little bit more of a how-to format than Marcus did, and to think through. Some of it is sort of after the fact, figuring out what it was that I did. Yeah. Less a kind of planned approach and more kind of an emergent process. And so, and I think this is true if anyone's studying media or studying things that involve screens. There's what happens kind of around the screen, what happens in the internet cafe or in the city of Accra. And then there's what happens like through the screens. I was trying to balance both. So I was trying to kind of sit and watch young Ghanaians chat with people online and to think a little bit about those people. I mean, this is difficult. I couldn't follow those connections and go sit with a chat partner in Malaysia and see what they were doing. So some of what was interesting was to note that that's who they were connecting with and communicating with, and then how they conceived of that site, how they conceived of their chat partner in Malaysia,
and where that sort of connected them to another, both sort of locally and translocally, right?
Yeah. So ways of tracing it, there are a number of different kind of ways of thinking of networks, like road networks, or digital networks, or social networks, and I think bringing all of those things together into around a topic, and the topic here is internet use, and how the internet became a meaningful thing for these young Ghanaians.